Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to NSCI 306. This is Lecture 6, and if you don't know this is Dr. Acker, you should probably read your syllabus. We're talking today about reading scholarship, which is one of the more difficult tasks you will do in college in general, but particularly in this class. And that's for a lot of reasons. The main thing in terms of rhetoric is the community in which these are produced and the community that typically reads them. I think one good way to get into this is to think about this idea of discourse communities, which is mentioned, I believe, in our course objectives. And the basic idea is that anytime you have a group of people, and it could be a group of friends, or it could be a company, it could be some other organization, one of the ways in which you develop expertise and you can develop kind of this sense of connection and camaraderie is by developing certain forms of discourse. You might have conversations using a certain level of vocabulary. You might have make certain language choices. Anything from this is the dialect we're going to use to these are the jargon terms that we're going to throw at you. And to an outsider, it's very, very confusing. But we do this sort of naturally. As we get used to a particular setting or particular group, there are even just kind of shortcuts. For instance, I've been playing a lot of tournament Scrabble these past couple of weeks and won my first division. I think I'm going to lose my second division pretty badly, but that's how you learn new words. And there are definitely kinds of discourse and vocab and jargon that are sort of unique to the Scrabble world, specifically the competitive Scrabble world, that don't make much sense outside those borders. And I think what you're going to run into the first time and even the first few times that you have to read professional scholarship is there's going to be kind of a similar barrier to you. Even if you're reading something that is in your major or in the field you want to go into, you're not an expert yet. You know some things, you have some ideas about where you want to go in your academic and professional career, but you're just not quite there yet to where you can just pick up a 30-page journal article and get through every single word of it. Well, some of that does get easier as you read more, but a lot of it is just getting some strategies down and trying to figure out how you can actually get through the reading and get the information that's going to be useful for you for whatever task it is. Particularly those of you who are thinking ahead to graduate school or to a professional career that involves a lot of research. You will get better at this, but you kind of got to start somewhere. So we're going to start with the now infamous article by Wakefield and colleagues positing a potential link between the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, and the development of autism in children. And we'll get into some of that discussion when we meet for our next Zoom session. But in our second hour, we're going to go back and give you some info there. Before we get there, though, I want to reassure you that this is a process. It's just like learning to read another language, essentially. And nobody gets it right the first time. I literally read academic jargon and academic articles for a living because I have to edit them. And so in any given week, I might be reading something in Chinese art history alongside an engineering article, alongside a business article of some sort. Now, I don't have to follow every single technical aspect, especially when the engineers start using math. That's when I say, no, I'm going to stop you right there and just skip over to the next word. I said to check the punctuation in their math, but that's about it. And that's because I know that there are some aspects of the argument I can follow once they define their terms. And there's some that I just have to kind of leave for their discourse community, for that set of experts. In fact, the first time I remember I had to read an academic book, I was a junior in college, and I was auditing a graduate seminar on post-colonial theory because I was sort of minoring in that. and I wanted to learn more about the profession. Well, our reading, we met once a week, and our reading for the first week was a 500-page anthology of post-colonial theoretical readings. Not literature, not history, none of the stuff that I was prepared for in my other classes, but just theoretical philosophical arguments about stuff that I didn't really understand. But I was an English major, and I knew that my job was to sit down and get through all of the reading. And so I took that 500-page book, and I cleared myself a nice space in the dorm lounge. It was a weeknight, so no one was there to bother me, fortunately. And I sat in that lounge for about 3 hours. And at the end of 3 hours, I was on page 15. And I really didn't understand a lot of pages 1 through 14, but I just hit a point and all over, like, I have to turn the page because I really don't know what else to do here. I'm going to get what I can out of this and try to do that. Well, I don't remember how many pages I got in. It wasn't 500, but I got part of the way through. And when I got to class that week, I was really concerned because I thought, is this what I have to do the rest of my career? I don't know if I can do this. How am I supposed to manage this workload with all the stuff I don't understand? And so I asked one of my classmates, I'm new to this. How do you do all of this? And he said, well, you don't actually read the whole book. You pick the stuff that's interesting or relevant to you, and you kind of skim the rest. And I actually found that to be a really helpful technique. Now, we're not going to talk so much about skimming techniques today, but I do want to give you some idea of how these articles are organized and structured and how you might potentially use them for your research tasks. In a week or so, we're going to be talking about paper 2, which is a research project. And for that, you will be reading a set of research articles in your field, scholarship. So this will be sort of a preview for that, and hopefully will also help you get a sense of the Wakefield article as we discuss that. So switch over to our lecture notes here with the always useful reminder that even if you are a Lego person, remember to wash your hands. In our first hour, I want to go over these 5 main ways of approaching the act of reading scholarship. And some of these connect to stuff we already talked about in terms of rhetoric. Excuse me, we will look at how we grapple with the audience or audiences for this. We're going to look at identifying the purpose for a given reading or given argument. We'll take you through the structure of a typical academic article. Sometimes that will vary by field. Then I want to look at kind of 2 models for reading a little more closely. Because you will find in papers like major paper 2, you do need to know the scholarship pretty well. If you move on to do a senior thesis or a graduate thesis, that will be a common pattern as well. But you'll also need to get to where you can skim strategically, skim tactically, and figure out what is going to be relevant for you. So we'll go through that in our first hour, and then I'll switch gears in the second hour a little bit. I want to start by giving you a little bit of a context for our discussion of the Wakefield study. You may have heard of this one before. It made kind of a big splash, and we're still seeing some of the repercussions of that. But to put that in context, I'm going to give you a little bit of a timeline of the research that has been done on that field and sort of how this particular controversy arose. They're going to go to the abstract for that article and use that as a very brief case study. Kind of going to take you word for word through that abstract, which is pretty short. It fit on 2 slides, and show you what we can learn about what Wakefield and his colleagues are trying to accomplish, and then use that to kind of prepare us for the rest of the article. It'll finish up by looking at some potential discussion questions for our next Zoom session, and I'll walk you through the week 5 assignments. So as with any genre, you need to think at some point about who is receiving this, who is the audience. You guys have gotten some practice in that with your last homework where you asked people for money. And I was seeing some really sophisticated rhetorical maneuvering in those letters because you know your audiences and you know that even if most parents or friends or bosses or whatever would respond this way to these appeals, this particular person is going to think differently. And that's even unconsciously going to shape how you write. The same thing applies here. So as you are trying to get a grasp on the article, a good first question is, what fields or academic disciplines are these authors from? What do they work in? Sometimes you will find articles written across fields, interdisciplinary work. For example, I edited an article on the concept of physical literacy within kind of the broader field of physical education. And it was co-authored by 5 or 6 different people, and they were all in different areas. Some of them were university professors, some of them worked in school administration, thinking about like PE classes, some of them worked for governments, and they're able to bring different perspectives there. So it's the follow-up question is, are these people writing to specialists who are also in those fields? Because since they're in a discourse community, as I mentioned earlier, if you're writing to specialists, you're going to make different choices. You're going to assume different things about what your audience knows. And generally speaking, the more specialized an article is, the harder it is to follow for outsiders. That doesn't necessarily mean it's worse or better written, but it means that they're going to assume a more sophisticated set of knowledge on their reader's part. You also want to think about the genre in connection to the audience. What kind of venue was this published in? Because the stuff you can find even on Google Scholar or on Academic Search Premier, EBSCO databases, all those that you probably run into before, they aren't always presented quite the same way. And we've already seen this. So last time we looked at 2 pieces by Ben Goldacre. One was published as a newspaper article in The Guardian, and one was published as a book chapter in Bad Pharma. And so they worked with different audiences and had different standards here. So I'm going to walk you through how these might affect the rhetorical techniques and the rhetorical moves you'll see. Start off with journal articles. Most of the stuff that you find in the library databases was published in a journal. A journal is just a magazine. So depending on where it was published, there might be an argument designed to appeal to a fairly broad group of scholars. Or it might be one of those where like 10 or 12 people really understand this topic and they're going to be reading that journal. Those are probably not very big journals. The article we are reading was from The Lancet. The Lancet is one of the largest medical journals in the world. And so effectively every single doctor reads it at some point. And so they had to appeal to a fairly broad audience there. What you can do to help you understand a given article, though, is look up the journal's webpage, because nearly every contemporary journal has one now, and figure out what kind of work do they typically publish and who are they typically trying to reach. That'll give you a sense of how to process the individual articles. Likewise, if you're reading excerpts from a book, do what you can to learn about the book's overall goals, overall purposes. We'll talk more about purpose on the next slide. Looking just for book reviews can help. A lot of journals publish reviews of academic books, so you can pull those up. So if you just plug in the author and the title of the book, and that can save you a lot of reading, for one thing, but it can also give you a sense of how that's going to work. Occasionally, you'll get a book that will have like a look inside feature on Amazon or on Google Books, or even the library website has some ebooks available, more so these days. So do what you can to figure those contexts out as well. Essay collections, you're kind of doing a similar technique here. Essay collections are usually organized around a particular occasion or a topic. Sometimes they might be all addressing similar research questions. So I edited an anthology of essays a few years ago on international math education. But it was still fairly specialized. It was like, how are these specific textbooks in, I think it was Korea, China, the US, and I want to say Singapore and Japan organized? How do they teach fractions differently? So it's not just, here's this big thing, education, and we're going to have kind of random essays. It's focused. Many times the introduction will identify that focus for you. So if you have access to the whole book, definitely read the first few pages of the intro, get a sense of how that's going to work and who it might appeal to. Lastly, for the conference papers, conferences are meetings put on by organizations, and like journals, they vary widely. Sometimes they try to attract thousands of scholars from many different specialties. Sometimes they're focused in on one particular specialty. For example, I went to the MLA, the Modern Language Association convention several years ago, and it's massive. There are thousands of people there. It meets right after Christmas, always in a very cold city. It's miserable in that sense because half of us have the flu, the other half are getting the flu, and it's frigid outside. We're in Boston. Now, I could pretty well assume that everyone at that conference had some interest either in literature or in modern languages. That might mean linguistics, that might mean history, so a whole bunch of different people there. But beyond that, it would depend on who goes to which conference, which sessions, who is browsing which book tables, stuff like that. And so I had some really interesting conversations with a lot of people who were so far outside of my field that I normally would not interact with them. On the other side of the spectrum, I also went to a much smaller conference just on one book, Ben-Hur by Lew Wallace, which I was writing a dissertation chapter about at the time. So it was very helpful for me. And it was a decent sized group. We probably had 30 or 40 people there, but it was much narrower than the MLA. So you could assume that everyone there had some expertise in that author and that period and that type of literature and so on. So again, doing your research to figure out what sort of information is available about these conferences can give you a lot of tips and clues into who it's trying to reach. Takes us to the rhetorical purpose of these articles. And don't just think in terms of why did the author write? Because usually that's because there was this interesting research problem and they wanted to do something to advance that. Also, if you're thinking about context here, think about why are you specifically reading this? Chances are, in most of your undergraduate coursework, your reading will be assigned. Paper 2 works a little bit differently because you'll be finding sources for yourself and reading those. A lot of research projects end up going there. But it helps to think about how and why and when you encounter this. So if your professor assigned this to you in a unit on ethics, then it makes sense that whatever class discussion or assignments attached to that are going to focus there. We're going to do this with the Stanley Milgram essay coming up in a couple of classes as well. There may be other contexts where something was recommended to you, maybe by an advisor or a classmate, maybe by another colleague, or maybe you found a citation in another paper. This is a really good place to look to find similar scholarship, and I'll get more into those techniques when we talk about research skills later on this quarter. Here's the background information is going to help you as well. So what do you already know about this particular paper or its authors? Have others cited it? And maybe think about how do they approach it? Is this everybody hates this paper, but we have to cite it? Is this this revolutionized the field and everyone's still really excited about it? Is this, okay, this is important, but we need to do something else about this? One good barometer is the number of citations on Google Scholar. So if you plug in the title and author to Google Scholar and it's just scholar.google.com. You will see the cited by link. It's a wonderful tool. The Wakefield article is cited by 3,500 or maybe more other sources, and I haven't read all 3,500 of them, but I would guess that most of them are criticizing Wakefield, or saying, kind of holding it up as a negative example. We'll talk about why that is a little bit later. But it's a good gauge of influence and popularity as well. If you're reading something for an assignment, think back to themes of the course. What topics are you looking at? Are there maybe certain structures that could be a research method? Is there a technique that could make this particularly useful? Does this connect to another text you're reading? So we see this a lot in my field of literary studies, because we'll be reading, say, a novel, and as part of that, the professor will assign a well-known essay on that novel. Whether or not they agree with that essay is another question, but it gives us some way to talk about the book, maybe in a way that we wouldn't have thought to do otherwise. If you have a recommendation, think about who gave it to you and in what context. Recommendations like on Amazon or Netflix can be helpful or not helpful, depending on how well it fits your particular interest in your particular context. I often ask for scholarly recommendations of articles and books from back in grad school, from my advisor or from my professors, and occasionally from my colleagues as well, my fellow grad students. And usually it works out pretty well, but I remember one time I had asked a colleague, can you recommend a good source to put on this list on Nathaniel Hawthorne, because I was interested in his work. And she's like, oh yeah, you have to read this book and this book and this book. It's like, okay, I've never heard of any of these, but I'm a newbie. Maybe they're really important. I just don't know about them yet. And so I put this one on the list. And when I sent my proposed list to my advisor, she highlighted that one and said, this book is completely stupid and you should never read it, or something to that effect. Because what had happened was the recommender really, really liked the book, but no one else really took it that seriously in the field. So live and learn on that one. For the citations, think about how closely this paper comes to your own topic or your own research interests. As you develop paper due, you're going to find a lot of stuff that's sort of relevant to what you want to read about, but not quite. And hopefully the stuff we'll go over today will help you distinguish between those as you develop those topics. This is a big one. Academic articles are structured very, very differently than probably anything you've ever read before. And this is why it takes 3 hours to get through page 15 or so. But it does help to know kind of where the parts are and generally how they work. And I'll show you how this plays out with the abstracts a little bit later in this lecture. Abstract is your best friend. This is typically very short, between 100 and maybe 300 words. It is a concise summary of the context in which the study took place, the methods used, that could be the instruments, the population study, whatever they're doing there. We'll show you an example of this in the second hour. Their major findings and results, and the takeaway, the implications and conclusions. So if you're a fan of suspense, don't read academic articles, because all of it is ruined in the first one. This is the giant spoiler alert of the whole article, which means you definitely need to read it if you're thinking about, should I bother investing the many hours it will take to get through this article? Because it will give you a good sense of how it's working. It's a jam-packed 250 words or so. From there, you get into the introduction. This is usually where the context is set up either for the research problem, and of course this will vary, there's infinite variety basically, depending on the field you're in and the kind of things you're investigating in. That word just would not end. Um, for example, if you are reading an engineering article, then this will probably be where it says, okay, here's what we have learned before about this question or this problem or this circumstance or this mechanism, and here's the issue that has arisen and what we need to address. That is a good way to segue into the next key section, which is the review of previous scholarship on the topic. It's called a literature review, and this is something that you will be doing in paper 2. We'll get more back to that later this quarter. This is also where you're going to see key terms defined, or at least mentioned, if not exactly well defined, and often where the authors develop their research questions or research hypotheses. Usually these are labeled pretty well, so that is helpful as you go through and figure out what the study is actually trying to do. Method section, I'm going to tell you up front, the method section is really hard to read. I have had friends in grad school and clients who just kind of skip the methods unless it's something really, really, really important to their work. Because this is the kind of drudgery of describing every single little thing about how they set up the method, how they set up the models, what sort of statistical analysis did they do, where did they gather the data, who participated in this, what surveys did they use, what scales, and all each of those surveys, what answers could each of the participants under the surveys give, and it can drag on for a while. For experimental studies, it's also here's what happened when we zapped the mouse and made it chase the cheese, or we're probably not actually doing that anymore, but stay tuned for Milgram. He was doing something like that, but not with mice. And then finally, after the method section, our reward is the results. And it is really okay to kind of skip over the methods for a little bit and read the results. And if you find that they are interesting and significant to your work, then maybe you can go back and see what's potentially relevant in the method section. The results are pretty straightforward. They are going to be descriptive and sometimes also numerical. So you see charts and graphs quite often here. You see tables, a few of those in the Wakefield article. And if there is any sort of quantitative analysis, stats, then that's going to be here as well. So back to logos. Finally, some articles will be oriented a little bit differently, but usually towards the end, you have some sort of discussion section, and that often dovetails into the conclusion. What the discussion does is it zeroes in on some particularly significant or interesting part of the results. Maybe that's something that was unexpected. Maybe that's something that's a new contribution to the scholarship or the field, new understanding of something. Usually the goal here is to test your research questions, answer those in some way, or test your hypotheses. And it's also where you bring up the previous scholarship. So if 9 out of 10 of the previous studies have found that X equals Y in this particular circumstance, and you say, wait a minute, X equals Z in my research, this is where you're going to say, what happened? Why is my approach more valid? And what can we do about this? What are maybe some of the implications? Finally, at the very end, you'll have a very important section identifying the limits of the study and opportunities for future work. Because every study is going to have limits. You can only gather data in a certain way. You can really only, maybe you only have access to certain types of data, or data from certain years, or data from a certain number of people. In the Wakefield study, there's a very small sample size. I think it's 12. I don't have it in front of me just at this moment. And that would be a limit. And so what you have to do is say, all right, here's something that we were not able to accomplish, or something that was otherwise could potentially cause a problem, and you need to acknowledge those. But that's also a good way to say, based on this limit, here's what future research could do. And that could be, here's the next study in the the sequence that I want to do in the next year, or when I get more funding, or whatever it is. It could be here's what other scientists or other sociologists or other economists or whatever it is could do with this problem or with this text or whatever, given what we have learned here. So the idea is to build on what you now know that you didn't know before. So it's kind of a good way to clarify, here's what I've contributed, and also to say, here's what else could be done. We're going to look at a technique for this, I believe, in the next lecture called using a naysayer, which I think will clarify some of that. So stay tuned for that. So that gives you a sense of how these are organized and kind of some basic rhetorical questions to ask about them. You will find that in any research project, some sources are going to be really helpful and really relevant, and you want to read those more closely, and some are not. And so as you distinguish between those two groups and decide what to follow up with, then you get into different kinds of reading. So just on the kind of the basic level here, some questions to ask about reading, even for just comprehension. I would encourage you to go through this, at least for the Wakefield article, possibly also some stuff on the next slide as well. First of all, you got to think of the title. Now, a lot of academic articles have extremely boring titles because they're descriptive. But they still highlight certain things. They will tell you what variables are important. They will tell you who might be interested in this. They will just tell you what terms the authors choose to use. So you can even go through the table of contents in our textbook and look at the different choices they make for the titles. Our title of the Wakefield article is technically, gotta breathe here, Ilio-lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children. Now, if they had actually called the article, Vaccines Cause Autism, y'all, then maybe they would get more attention, but that's a different kind of study, different set of expectations. And so that is going to tell potential readers that these are the main variables under discussion, and potentially something about the relationship among them. Here we have a list, so we don't know exactly what relationships they're positing yet, but we'll look for that in our discussion. I talked about the abstract earlier, the one we want to read closely. So think about, how does this describe the article's goal or purpose? And a good abstract will also clarify, here are the main contributions of this particular study. What does this let us do now? Where's our so what and our now what? This is why you want to read the abstract slowly, but also pretty closely. We'll practice that in the second hour. From there, about the methods. So how is this data being gathered? And this is where you can bring it back to your own context. If there is a methodology in place that you know nothing about, it might be helpful to do a quick Google and see, what can I learn about how this works? And how is this going to potentially help me understand this topic or this data? It can also help you distinguish among similar studies, because a lot of scholars will write on very similar topics, and it's really easy to get them conflated. One key difference is often the particular methods that they used. So maybe this study will say, well, all this other work has mainly been quantitative. They mainly focus on numbers. What if we went to qualitative data, looking at experiences, looking at interviews, asking what's it like to go through this? Is that going to be better or worse? Well, that's a complicated question, but it does help you distinguish between those, and it does give you a sense of what might be coming up. Likewise, think about the specific results and the implications. Again, this is a giant spoiler alert for the whole article. So this is a good time to evaluate what did they find, and is this interesting or surprising? Does this contribute somehow to a trend you're interested in? Does this sound weird or counterintuitive to you? Like, I wouldn't expect that result from that setting, because that could be a good reason to keep reading. If you find something compelling or interesting or controversial, there's opportunity to talk about that more. So you can keep reading there. You want to go back to the conclusion. So how does this summarize the study's approach and value? What do they say about what they've done? They should acknowledge some limits. If they don't, that might be a giant red flag. So which limits do they acknowledge? Is this in terms of particular methods? Do they say, man, I wish I had more data from this population or on this topic, or I wish we could have looked at this other related population, or there's this other variable that we didn't analyze but could be really important here, and we should do that. Somebody should do that in the future. This is a rhetorically healthy and intellectually healthy exercise. What have I done? Yay, I've done this. But what couldn't I do? What could someone else do in the future? What would I like to do if I had different data or better data or more time, or let's be realistic, grant funding for doing this again? That'll teach you a lot about how they approach the topic. We can also think about this at kind of a more strenuous level, thinking about engaging with the scholarship. And this is going to be questions and techniques that are more helpful for the things that you're going to use more directly. So it's this constant balancing act of finding useful sources and finding sources that can, like, I'll put it differently. You can find sources that will give you a lot of information, but information is not always helpful for your particular research problem. So the more you know about your problem, the better you can figure out potential solutions or learn from others' work. So step back and think meta here. So now that you have done at least some of the reading, if you skip the method section, it's okay, I'm not going to tell anybody. But you have learned something, hopefully. So based on what you have learned, which parts are most relevant for the task you have at hand? And this is why my classmate way back when told me to read parts of the book and not try to read the whole thing. Because people have different interests, and especially in something like an essay collection, different sections are going to be relevant for that. In the course of my grad career, I can't tell you how many times I would get a whole book just for that one chapter, even just like the 7 or 8 page discussion of that one text that I was interested in, or that one character or theme or historical detail or something like that. And this is a learned skill. So the more practice you get in reading these, the better you'll be able to identify what is relevant to your task. Also think structurally. How do each of these sections connect back to the paper's main point? Do they support the thesis claims? Do they support the hypotheses? Do the conclusions work with the information you've been presented? So go back to claims and evidence, just like you do for a peer critique and hopefully for your own papers as well. A very important question to ask in a classroom context is, what sort of reading are you expected to do? And the course theme and the sort of the tenor of the course and sort of the skills that it focuses on are going to give you a big clue to that. This is a writing course. It's not a course on immunology or gastroenterology or psychology or big pharma or any of this, but we're reading stuff about that. And so it makes sense that as you are doing the reading for this course, you should notice, how is it written? What sort of techniques do you see? What sort of tasks do you have attached to that? Always read with your homework in mind, basically. We will be looking, for example, at 4 related essays in our next block, all on a particular psychological experiment that was done in the 60s. We'll be reading the original account of the experiment, pairing that with a personal kind of recollection from one of the participants read many years later. And then we're going to look at a contemporary criticism of the original author, as well as that author's response to the criticism. And so for different elements there, we're looking at different things. And that's going to be actually the comparison part, I believe, is going to be the prompt for your second response paper. So that'll be something that you can use specifically there. It's also helpful to know how formally you're going to be responding to this. There may be contexts where you're just expected to read something and discuss it in class. There may also be some sort of follow-up assignment. So I was a mean teacher. When we started this quarter, we discussed Jared Diamond's Easter's End, and we discussed Fred Pierce's battle between skeptics and scientists, or whatever he called it exactly, battle over climate data. But we also wrote about both of those for Diamond for the first response paper and Pierce for that first exercise on tone. And I did that deliberately, of course, because I wanted you to engage not just in discussion, but in writing. So you have to know different things and notice different things and engage it at different levels there. So the more you know about that ahead of time, the better. If this is just a source where you're going to need to put it in a footnote and say, yes, I read this, I know what they argued, and move on, then you can read it more quickly. If it's a source you're going to be wrestling with over the course of 2 or 3 pages, you better know that in a lot more detail. A good question to ask then is, how could I intelligently discuss this in a meeting, particularly an advisory meeting, those of you who have done some of those projects already. Or if you're a professor, you come to office hours, professor says, so what did you think of Diamond's Easter's End? How would I talk about it in a breakout group? This doesn't necessarily mean you have to know everything about the essay, but it means you can ask good questions, that you know enough of it to be able to engage with that in some detail. One of the things that I looked for when I was grading your first set of response papers was, where do you pull the quotes from? Do you show evidence that you've read and considered the entire essay and not just 1 or 2 things at the beginning? Can you connect your ideas in kind of a more sophisticated way to those sections? And the essays that did that best got the highest grades. That's just kind of how I grade those. I want to see that you don't just show me that you have read the text. Show me that you understand it and you can say something interesting in response to it. I've gathered some supplementary resources for you. This slide is on reading scholarship. Just a good way to go through things like, what is an argument? UNC Writing Center has a good handout on that. The first one by Professor Kip Wheeler is excellent. It's a little long-winded, but it gives you a lot of helpful things. And there are a couple reading academic papers as well to supplement the thing that you read for today. Then this slide is on evaluating scholarship. This will be more relevant to you when you get to paper 2, but I wanted to give those to you now so you can get a sense of how you can work with potential sources for a paper. Okay, we're going to take our break here and get back to the immediate context for the Wakefield essay, as well as do a close reading of the abstract. That's the word. We come back in the second hour. Stay tuned.